Thanks, Noel. When you mentioned my wife, other people have done that, and then everybody expects me to talk about recipes, or the first question I get after I talk about whatever I'm going to talk about is, what's my favorite meal? Am I really having chicken on Friday night? That kind of thing. I have a very warm feeling about being here because I've actually had a lot of interaction with various councils on world affairs and foreign relations around the country over the years. My first experience was in the mid-'70s, and I was in the Ford administration working for Henry Kissinger. And I used to write a lot of speeches for him and for some of the undersecretaries. And I wrote a speech for a fellow named Bill Rogers, who at the time was the Undersecretary of State, I think for Economic Affairs. And he gave the speech at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. And by sheer accident, I was invited, this is the first time I'd ever been invited to speak on foreign affairs by the World Affairs Council in Portland, Oregon. And since it was so far away, I figured it was safe to give exactly the same speech since I had written it. And I went to Rogers' speech, and then 2 days later I showed up in Portland. And I was astounded. The questions in Portland were so much better. They were so much more sophisticated. I cringed. I realized that in this enormous country, to be focused only on New York or Washington was really to miss the whole thing. And years later, I wrote my first book called A Cold Peace. It was about the competition between the U.S., Japan, and Germany. And I think I must have spoken at 7 or 8 of the councils. And it was a wonderful experience. But one thing in the theme of sophistication, my book, it was 1992, I think, shortly after the Cold War ended, was all about Germany, Japan, and the U.S. And the first question I got at every council was, what about China? I said, to me, China was nothing. But the public at large really was way, way ahead of the kind of stuff that pundits like me were writing about. I'm going to talk today about emerging markets. And it's an issue that is really reflected in my own career. My first job in working for Kissinger was to keep track of something called the Agenda for the 7th Special Session of the United Nations. Now, nobody will remember what the 7th Special Session was, but it happened after the OPEC embargo. And after that, developing countries around the world were seized with the notion that they had leverage that they didn't realize because they controlled commodity markets. And the 7th Special Session was almost a massive protest by developing countries about the structure of the international system. And my job after the 7th Special Session was to keep track for the U.S. government on 50 different proposals that Kissinger had made to deal with almost uprising of developing countries. This would have been, I think, about 1975. So I got really into the weeds about what developing countries wanted, what the U.S. was promising, whether or not we were delivering on those things. And it was almost a year I did nothing but follow these 50 initiatives and keep track. That was the 1970s. In the 1980s, I was at Lehman Brothers, and I was an advisor to the finance ministers of developing countries who had borrowed a lot of money and suddenly couldn't repay. This was the beginning of developing countries' involvement in a global financial system And by just luck, I had a real ringside seat because this was the beginning of the whole change in global finance away from just Europe and the US to the rest of the world. In the 90s, I found myself in the Commerce Department, and we launched a very well-known initiative, actually, which I announced at the Foreign Policy Association. It was called the Big Emerging Markets. And for the first time, the American government focused on 10 big emerging markets as the sort of the future. And since then, I have been at Yale teaching and writing about emerging markets. And in fact, very recently, I wrote a couple of articles in Foreign Policy magazine about where emerging markets were headed, and I'm going to try to highlight some of those themes today. As a professor, I always say to my students that the most important thing in dealing with any big issue, any big challenge, is to understand how big or how small it is. And I tell them the thing to do is to draw a box. Draw a box around the challenge. But the box has to be precisely the right size. If it's too small, you can miss the whole thing. But if it's too big, you're rummaging around in something and you may miss the core of what you really need. So drawing that box is really key. And I say this because today I want to draw that box. And I want to draw it around emerging markets with reference to 4 different questions. The first is, what are we talking about when we say emerging markets? The second is, what is the current situation now, and how do I project it over the next 5 or 10 years? The third question is, why does it matter? What is the significance of emerging markets today? How should we think about both their predicament and their significance to us? And finally, I'd like to talk about the implications for American foreign policy and what I think basically the thrust of American foreign policy should be, given the significance of emerging markets and also the condition that they're in. And I'm going to leave a lot of time for questions. I know you've heard other speakers say I'm going to leave a lot of time for questions, and then it never happens. But I'm very sensitive to this because I once saw somebody who said, I'm only going to speak for 15 minutes and then I'm going to take questions. And this speaker went on and on and on and was obviously totally seized with his own words. And in the middle of his talk, somebody got up and started to walk out of the room. The speaker couldn't believe it, and he stopped what he was saying and he said, "Sir, sir." The person turned around and looked at him, and the speaker said, "Where are you going?" And the fellow said, "I'm going to get a haircut." Well, the speaker said, "You're going to get a haircut? Why didn't you get a haircut before you came?" And he said, "I didn't need one before I came." So there will be questions and answers. Let me just take the first issue that I mentioned. Who are the emerging markets? I can do this fairly quickly, but the very notion of emerging markets as opposed to just developing countries, arose sometime in the 80s because it really didn't seem like you could put a country such as South Korea in the same category of, say, Haiti. And I think the basic idea was that, there were 3 kinds of countries. There were those that were really, really poor. There were those that were in the middle, and then there were high growth countries, mostly in Asia. So emerging markets really was not the poorest, but the others. I think that the Clinton administration had a lot to do with shaping some views about emerging markets, because when we talked about big emerging markets, we had the courage to actually define 10 countries. And we picked 10 countries that we thought were not only emerging economically, but actually were playing a major role in global politics and geopolitics. So we picked 10: South Korea, China, India, and Indonesia in Asia. We picked only one in Africa, which was South Africa. We picked two in let's say, Europe and Central Europe, Turkey and Poland. And then we picked Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina. And whether we were right or wrong, maybe you could have substituted one or two, that was much less significant than that we had basically focused on a group of countries that were really influential and were going to become much more influential. And of all of those, I think the only one we probably guessed a little wrong was Argentina, at least insofar as you look at it today. At the same time, there was Paul Kennedy, a colleague of mine at Yale, wrote a series of papers and books on pivotal states. And he didn't think China was an emerging market. He thought it was a superpower. But he added Algeria and Egypt as being really influential in terms of how the world would work. Most of you heard about Goldman Sachs's categorization when they talked about the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and eventually South Africa. But I must say that was much more of an economic investment kind of notion than global politics. And the World Bank and Morgan Stanley, others have all kinds of definitions. And I just want to say, for the purpose of our discussion, I would like to just stipulate that there are about 10 or 15 countries, which are not advanced industrial countries, that have enormous amount of influence and will continue to have that kind of influence. And that's really what I'm talking about when I say emerging markets. So what's the situation now? I think one way to look at that is to look back 10 years and ask, what did emerging markets represent about a decade ago? And I think one thing they certainly represented, this is where everyone thought the future growth would come from. This is where a number of people thought the big investment opportunities would be. This is where multinational companies saw the future markets, particularly around the rise of the middle classes. This is where we thought a lot of innovation would come, almost reverse innovation. That is, things that were happening in developing countries that we could import into the US. And I remember when India was developing a car for $2,000, where our cars were $35,000. Those Indian cars wouldn't pass our regulations, but between 2,000 and 35,000, there seemed to be a lot of technology that we could adapt for our own systems. 10 years ago, the growth story, what was called the secular growth story in emerging markets, made a lot of people feel that if that story actually came to pass, not only would there be economic growth, but there would be a lot of political liberalization. That is, all good things eventually went together. We would see more democracy. We would see better human rights situations. And after the financial crisis of 2008, when emerging markets actually did much better than anybody thought they would, there was even a sense that the dynamism in emerging markets was so great that they were decoupling from the West. That is, that they had their own growth trajectory, and whatever happened to us was less important than we thought would have been the case before. Those emerging markets, which are most of them that rely on exporting commodities, they have been badly clobbered because the price of commodities have come way down. including oil. And the assumption that I mentioned that somehow economic growth leads to political liberalization, it might be the case in some countries, but in two that are very visible, in Russia and China, there's no evidence at all that economic growth has translated into political liberalization. Now, why is this? What happened that made such a different picture from 10 years ago until now? There's no one explanation, but here are a couple. First of all, economists did the unconscionable thing, and they made straight-line projections. The 1990s was kind of a golden age for globalization. Emerging markets were coming from a very low base, and a lot of people just projected straight out, which is not anywhere consistent with how the global economy works. A second thing that happened is that because the world economy was quite buoyant, emerging markets naturally didn't want to do the hard reforms. They didn't have to. Money was pouring in. And on top of that, when the US Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank, Bank of Japan lowered interest rates, lots of money flowed out of the west of the industrialized countries looking for higher rates, and they all went to emerging markets. So they were swamped with money. They didn't have to do any reforms. They got all the capital they could possibly want and more. Third, the energy price collapsed. And for a lot of the countries, particularly in the Gulf, dependent on oil exports, that was an additional negative factor. And then China's growth slowed, and China is a major importer of commodities. So there was a lot of things going on that you could say were really not of the making of emerging markets, or else they were just part of a global economy. They had become integrated, and as the global economy slowed, as trade slowed down, emerging markets were badly hit. In fact, I would put it this way, that we have been experiencing a financial slowdown in 4 stages. First came the US after the financial crisis. Then came the European financial crisis. Then came the slowdown in China. And now what we're seeing is the 4th stage, the 4th shoe to drops, as it were, and that is the rest of emerging markets. How long will this take? I think it's going to go on for at least 5 years, maybe 10. I think that the world economy itself is in a slow growth stage and is going to stay that way for a number of reasons. One is there are very powerful deflationary forces that are swamping over the entire global economy. And this means slower growth, slower demand, and it can be kind of a downward spiral. And the unfortunate fact is nobody knows what to do about this. Central banks have been lowering interest rates, thinking that that would create some inflation, but it obviously hasn't worked anywhere near as hoped. Second thing is that productivity in most of the world has slowed down. And here's another thing that, I can give you a bunch of explanations, but the bottom line is nobody really knows why. It could be just an interim thing, and we may have a lot of great technology that eventually will enter the system, but right at this moment, the projections that I believe in the most show a slowdown in productivity for several years. China, I think, is on a slow growth course, and that is partially because they're in a transition in terms of economic models. Bob Zoellick talked about that a little bit. And the oil price, if you looked at the International Energy Agency's projections, the oil price is not going to rise at least for another 5 years and maybe longer. So all these factors are going to be hanging around, and emerging markets, I think, will be scurrying to service their dollar debt and to deal with low commodity prices. But I do not believe that they're going to come out of this in the next several years. In addition, there are two other factors that are worth noting. One is that I do believe we are on the verge of, call it a third industrial revolution, where these major technologies like 3D printing and robots with artificial intelligence and sensors, all of that is coming very fast. We in the United States are going to have a big problem accommodating that when it comes to labor. Emerging markets are going to have a terrible problem because they have so many people who will not be able to use this technology. Or to put it another way, the technology will disintermediate so much of their labor that is going to be a drag on their growth. And the other thing is that I think globalization itself is slowing. You look at trade, the volume of trade as compared to economic growth is as slow as it's been, I think, for a decade, maybe more. If you look at finance, there's a tremendous amount of regulation that has been entered into the system that is actually causing international finance to become less global than it was before. And so if you look at the political dimension, Bob Zoellick talked about the need to reinvent a lot of the political institutions of globalization. I totally subscribe to that, but we just do not have a political architecture that can deal with these global forces now. So those are other factors that I think are going to weigh on emerging markets. Now, having presented this very optimistic picture to you, I want to ask, how should we think about emerging markets in that situation? And in the same way that I think it's very dangerous to make a straight line projection when things are going well, it's also dangerous to make it when things are not. And there's a great temptation now to say, you know, for a decade or two or three, emerging markets were really very, very important, but we're entering another era, and that was then. I think that would be a horrific mistake, because a lot of the things that emerging markets represent are still true. In my view, under any circumstance, they're going to represent close to half of global GDP. In my view, they will remain very, very important to global finance and global trade, even if both of those slows down. In my view, they are central to a lot of the challenges that we face in the world, whether it's climate change, whether it's human rights, whether it's poverty. No matter what happens, we are going to see the rise of a gigantic middle class, and no matter what happens, we're going to see hyper-urbanization on a scale no one had ever thought about. It's all happening in emerging markets, with enormous implications for economics and social policy and political pressures. And when it comes to global governance, we're not going back to the G7. We have a G20 now. It's going to stay at least a G20. So no matter how much growth slows in emerging markets, in terms of political governance, they're going to have a big voice. I think it's very important to understand that the centrality of emerging markets is a key feature of the global outlook, but I want to take it one step further. A lot of people associate emerging markets with a new kind of multilateralism. And when they say that, they're thinking about some other times in history when several countries or a dozen countries were important in sort of running the world. Some facsimile of a balance of power. But that's not exactly what's happening in my view. And I can describe some of the features of what's happening, but I'm not smart enough to go too deep into it for the following reasons. We have a global financial system that nobody really understands anymore. This is a complex adaptive system. It is almost like biodiversity. It is so disaggregated and it is so diverse. And we don't know where the actual nodes are, and we don't know where the connections are. All I know is that emerging markets are very much part of that scene. We have a trading system based now on extended, attenuated supply chains. This isn't about just exporting and importing. It has to do with the structure of production around the world in the most complex ways. And all I know is that emerging markets are central to that. Whether you look at climate change, whether you look at refugees, whether you look at terrorism, any of these issues, my view is we don't quite understand how the system is working. But what we can say is that this is not just about the US and 3 or 4 other countries. These are you almost have to conceive of them as very complex webs where there are certain nodes and where certain connections are more important than others. But the understanding of emerging markets and the role of emerging markets is key to all of that. What is the implication for US foreign policy? Here, I want to be clear that I understand that we have a huge agenda, and also that the political environment is not conducive to any big initiatives. But what I want to say is that, I want to tell you a story. I was once talking to Andy Grove. This was around 2000. Andy Grove at the time was head of Intel. And he was explaining to me that the secret of Intel's success was that they always invested, they gunned their investments, they increased their investments when things got bad. And when all other entities basically let up and said, okay, this is the time we're not going to do R&D, that's when Intel really bore down. And when the cycle changed, they were there much stronger than anyone. And it's that picture that I have in my head about American foreign policy when it comes to emerging markets. This is the time when we have a great temptation to say they don't matter so much anymore. They're not what we thought they would be. They're not the big growth leaders. We're not going to reap all the benefits. A lot of American multinational companies might feel, hey, those markets are not as vibrant as we thought. But from the standpoint of American government, this is the time to double down. And when I say double down, I'm not talking about a Marshall Plan. I'm not talking about an alliance for progress. I'm just talking about strengthening bilateral and multilateral relationships at a time when it would really matter to emerging markets, and at a time when, because that cycle will change. And on the other side, the US would be in a much, much stronger position if we didn't do the easy thing, which is to take our eye off the ball. So I'd like to see 2 things, basically. One is, in every bilateral relationship in these 10 or 15 countries that really matter, is to ask the question, can we do something in terms of economic cooperation? Can we do something culturally? Can we strengthen military cooperation? And when it comes to multilateral, there are a few issues that mean an awful lot to emerging markets. And perhaps the biggest one right now is that in the International Monetary Fund, there is a plan to give emerging markets more voting power. The days when the US and Europe and Japan controlled the IMF, that should be over. And in the US Congress, they simply won't allow that to happen. And that one thing would be a huge, both symbolic and very important political move. And another multilateral thing is, we have the World Bank, this new Asian investment bank. We're in a position to supply lots of guarantees for investments in infrastructure. That's something that can go forward. The world is awash in liquidity. So my view is that at this particular period when emerging markets are really down and out, the United States should basically say, we're going to do something that is very counter to what we would normally do. We're going to expand our involvement. We're going to expand our investment. I don't just mean investment in money, but investment in human resources, investment in collaboration. I'm going to conclude with another story, and I have been teaching a course at Yale, and I take students to China to study global markets from a Chinese perspective. And we were in a meeting with a major investor in Hong Kong, someone who has invested $2 billion in China, in real estate. And one of the students said to him, don't you worry at night that there's going to be a crisis in China and you're going to lose your money? And he said, no. He said, I know there's going to be a crisis in China. He said, that is foregone. China cannot defy gravity. Every country has big crises, and China's due, and whether it's this year or 5 years from now, I don't know when it's going to happen. I'm more concerned with what happens after the crisis, what China learns from it, and what comes out the other side. Does it mean that China will embrace more market principles or less? Does it mean it will be more repressive or less? What lessons will they draw? And I tell this story because I think it's relevant to emerging markets generally. We are in a crisis. The emerging markets are in a crisis. There's no question about it. I don't think there's a question that it's going to be a long time. But the real issue is what comes out the other end. And that's why the U.S. has to be there. And that's why we have to be there in great depth and with great enthusiasm and with great force. Because on the other end, we want to have the influence that we should have and we could have. And we want to be there to help shape the lessons. President Obama has made a big deal of the Pacific Trade Agreement by saying this is, in one big way, a competition with China for who writes the rules. He may be right. I'm willing to stipulate that he's right. But this is another instance where China will take a longer-term view than we would naturally take when it comes to emerging markets. We see the problem. We have the opportunity. We don't need to spend a huge amount of money. We just have to make the appropriate effort. And I think that would be a great issue for American foreign policy, a great challenge, and one that we could actually easily meet in the years ahead. Thank you very much. Brazil is really a great example of all the things I talked about. Hurt badly by the slowdown in China because Brazil is such a major exporter of commodities to China. Hurt by the oil situation, the energy situation, because they had great aspirations to be a major player in the energy arena. Hurt by the phenomenal growth that they had, and they didn't make the kind of reforms they should. And hurt by the slowdown of the global economy itself. But over and above all that, I think the problem in Brazil has been a political system that was actually more corrupt than most people realized, and a inability to really read the future, an inability to not to basically spend everything they had all the time. No long-term horizon. And I suspect that the lessons that they should draw I don't know what they will draw, but the lesson they should draw is that it's a long game and you have to play it that way. And they should have, instead of being a commodity exporter forever, they should have really moved upscale in terms of industry. The corruption, that I don't know. I mean, I'm sure they're going to draw a lesson about that, but whether they can really exorcise that is, I think, a big question. It's a very sad case because they have gone from being one of the real 3 or 4 top emerging markets to a country that is likely to have some problems for long time to come. And there's so much energy, there's so much innovation there that it's a real shame. I agree with you. That's one of the reasons why I think that the problems that emerging markets are going to have they're going to linger for quite a while. And even if a commodity cycle moves up, given the way the structure of the world economy is working, the amount of substitution that is going to be possible, just the industrial structure is becoming so much lighter in terms of what it's using, whether it's energy or whether it's steel, that those countries now have to formulate plans that are not based on a return of commodity prices from where they are. Otherwise, they will be in the dumps forever. And that's one of the things I think the U.S. can work with them on. We can't solve it. In fact, we're part of the problem because we're going to use less and less, as is Europe and as is, in fact, even China will use less. So that handwriting is on the wall. You're absolutely right. This is a really major problem, and there's no quick answer. There's no formula other than if you look 10 years, you've got to diversify the economy away from commodity dependence. And for those countries that can't, they're in a huge bind. Think of, I'll give you just one scenario, okay? If we had hours, we could go, but let me give you one which is not so divorced from real possibility. Let's say that it's December or January, and the Fed goes ahead and raises interest rates. Okay, and let's stipulate that there are a handful of emerging markets where the private sector, the private sector companies and the banks have loaded up on dollar-denominated debt. And that more than, nobody knows this precisely, but that many of them are already on the verge of having real repayment difficulties. And the interest rate goes up, and the psychology of the market is such that everybody panics, and there's a series of defaults. Okay, and one of the things about the financial markets today that is different than it might have been 20 years ago is that the psychology outruns the real world situation. And so we could have the beginnings of a big financial crisis that starts somewhere. I don't know where, but every time it started, every time there has been one, it started where no one thought it would. And what you have to assume is that this financial system is very tightly taught. It's very taut. And so a problem in one area is now communicated globally very, very quickly. We have a situation in the U.S. where it is not at all clear that the government will bail out big banks again. I know this is a subject of debate, but what isn't a subject of debate is that Congress has told them they can't and has restricted the Federal Reserve's ability to do it the way they did it in 2008. So you could see a bunch of things happening in that financial arena, starting in an emerging market that has too much dollar debt, and it could happen very fast. So that would be one possibility for a crisis, I think. Another possibility could happen with some sort of a cyber or terrorist attack on some financial node, which we don't know is a big node in some financial center. But I think it's in that financial arena that we have to be the most worried. The whole financial system is in a state of great unsettlement. Well, I'm really glad you chose to come back to that issue of complexity, because I think, I teach a course at Yale on the future of global finance. And I start with an interview that I did, which is on tape, with the chief economist of the Bank of England. And he is comparing the financial system to the ecological systems, to epidemiology. And he's talking about a complex system that is changing all the time. And the point of it is that we try to regulate something without understanding that you hit it here and it just moves there. And I want to make that case with the whole international structure. So I'm glad you gave me a chance to reemphasize it. I don't think we can solve that with emerging markets. All I'm saying is that at a time when they're really down and out, we should be deepening our involvement with them. It isn't about solving the problems. It's about building the relationships. It's about having them realize we care. One of the things I would do, if I were ever in a position, is that we have a huge number of people in the U.S. who could be sent to these countries from time to time just to have discussions about how the world is evolving. Bob Zellick is a perfect example of somebody. He's in the private sector now. But I can name a dozen, or people in universities like Joe Stiglitz, who have a lot to say. They don't necessarily have the answers. But one of the things that's, I think, happened after the Cold War, though it seems like a long time ago, is the U.S. stopped sending people the way they used to, on the theory that, well, everybody's free and everybody has access to all the information and all the people. But it isn't true. So I'm really talking much more about deepening relationships, deepening dialogues. As I said, it's not a Marshall Plan. We could all conjure up something bigger than that, but that's not going to happen. I think what I'm proposing is relatively modest. It's just that it requires a change of mindset, and it requires saying, for the next 10 years, these countries may not be as vibrant as we thought they would be, but we're going to bet on the longer term, because they're not going away. And we know what the nature of these global problems are, and they're going to be part of them. For better or worse, we are not in this alone, and it's not just us in Europe, and it's not just us in Japan, and it's not just us in China. There's just a whole swath of countries, the Indias, the Brazils, the Mexicos, that are really going to count. And we should not take our foot off the accelerator, even though they are in difficult situation. Well, if you would have asked me in the 90s whether corruption would be as big a problem as it still is, I would have said that we're in an era of more and more transparency. We'll see it naturally come down. Now I'm just not sure. I'm just not sure. It's deeply rooted in some of these societies, and it's obviously a real cancer. But I think you have to take it country by country, and not all of them. Well, some of them are really, making progress. What can we offer? I'm very humble about America's providing advice on issues like that. I think it has to be multilateral. I think somehow, we have to figure out a way to sell our values in a different way other than head-to-head, bilaterally. That doesn't work so well anymore. But it's still worth doing. It's just that we need some, as Bob Selleck said, we've got to do this in partnership with other countries. So, but I do think it's a problem. Yeah, I think it definitely emerging market, and You know, if in any grouping, you know, I started by talking about what are emerging markets, how do you think about them? There's no way to talk about emerging markets, no matter how you want to classify them, without having India in the middle. As economic promise, as political influential, it is exceedingly important. And I actually think that the U.S. has been doing a very good job in terms of building up its relationship with India. As you intimate, it's a really complex situation because in a way it's two countries. Huge promise and enormous poverty and dysfunction. But I'll tell you this, China is very complicated, and I wouldn't want to bet how the U.S. and China are going to evolve in terms of their relationship over the next decade. But I would bet that when it comes to India, so long as there's not some kind of a nuclear war between India and Pakistan, this is the one big country in Asia where it's a sure thing that we are going to get closer and closer. I think they want it, we want it. You know, I think we're, for some reason, much more sensitive to their sensitivities than we are to a lot of other countries. So I think this is a bright spot. In fact, even among all the emerging markets, in terms of just growth, that's the best story. It's not the greatest story in the world, but that's the best story of all the ones that you can picture. So I just want.
Thank you very much for gracing the floor.